Welcome to the Commonwealth Club. I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized tonight's event. I'd like to welcome all of you who are watching this live stream and all of you who will watch it later on YouTube. This is one of over 700 programs that the Commonwealth Club has done since the pandemic began, using our facilities to keep bringing you the programs that we brought you live before that. Now, today we have Jacob Mishengama from Denmark, who is here to speak about his book, A History of Free Speech, From Socrates to Social Media. And we have Jacob here from Denmark, and we're going to talk about, well, first of all, free speech is obviously part of our culture, part of the American Bill of Rights, a very important thing to the founders. But much more than that, as Jacob says in his book, it's about the culture of appreciating free speech. And the history of that we'll also talk about. But it's important, I think, for everybody to understand that authoritarianism is pretty much the default mode in human affairs and has been for thousands of years. Probably an outgrowth of our narcissism that we just want everybody to do what we want them to do. And if you get in power, that's how you behave. On the other end of the spectrum, of course, is chaos. And chaos is even less attractive to human society than the authoritarianism. So somewhere in between, how much freedom can we have? How much free speech can we have? Where do the lines get drawn? And what can we learn from history about where it's mistaken where we draw those lines? So thank you very much for joining us from Denmark, Jacob.
Yeah, thanks, George. Actually, I'm right now. I'm in a hotel in DC, but it's right.
Okay.
I'm based in Copenhagen.
Okay, great. So. First of all, I know that you've started a foundation also to promote this idea, which you did several years ago. So why don't you tell us about why you did that? You're a very young man. You got started at a very young age to push this idea and bring it to society. A clearer idea about what we should do about this.
Yeah, so the reason why, I'm born and raised in cozy, liberal, secular Denmark, where free speech was taken for granted for much of my youth, and I didn't really think about it. And then, as some of you might remember, a Danish newspaper published a number of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad, which sort of created what I would call a global battle of values over the relationship between free speech and religion, and suddenly Denmark became the epicenter of this debate, and that very much forced me and many other Danes to think about, why is this value so important? Is it important? Why does it matter? Also because a number of people who would have previously seen themselves as champions of free speech got cold feet because they saw the cartoons as basically punching down on a vulnerable minority, and therefore that there should be limits on free speech, or at least that it should not be exercised in what they would call an irresponsible manner. And then later on, I saw how people on the right, who very much supported free speech during the cartoon affair, suddenly were willing were in favor of limits on free speech targeted at minorities, so i.e. Extremist Muslims, and so principle was in very short supply, and so I was interested in if free speech is such an important part of free and democratic societies, why are we so unprincipled about it, and what is it that seduces us into accepting free speech for me but not for thee, and how do we create robust cultures of free speech, and who were the ones who paved the way for the degree of free speech that we take for granted in many open democracies today. So that's what a large part of the work in the think tank that I run, but also this podcast called Clear and Present Danger, A History of Free Speech, which went before the book and which runs into, I think, 42 episodes or something like that.
Wow, that's great. Certainly, your history shows that we just have to keep reminding ourselves about its value and the value of the principle. But another principle, that's not the same at all, but has the same sort of issue. The principle is there so that during tough times you remember what you're supposed to do. It's not really all that. The principle isn't that useful when everything is going smoothly.
Exactly, and I think we tend to forget that in open democracies because we've been lucky enough not really to have to fight for it for a long time. So, you and I can sit, you're in the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. We can speak, directly, even though we're thousands of miles apart. And I sit here as a guest in the United States. I can criticize the president, the past president, powerful politicians, and no one will arrest me. But if you and I were sitting in Russia or Iran, someone would be waiting for me down in the lobby, and I would, be disappeared into some prison, never to be heard of again. Or if I was lucky, being put on a plane and never be able to return to the country. But when we're having this discussion, and you at the Commonwealth Club, you have hundreds of these discussions, all kinds of topics that you can freely discuss. But I don't think that we don't tend to think of it as exercising our First Amendment freedoms. We're just having, we're just having discussions as every day. But, as we can perhaps return to, there have been many periods in the history of the United States where all kinds of topics that we today take for granted were prohibited, despite the First Amendment, there were laws, whether at the state or federal level, that prohibited, for instance, criticizing the president or Congress, or speaking out against slavery, or speaking out against racial segregation, speaking out in favor of the rights of women, and so on. These are topics that we today take for granted that we can discuss and address, but that was not the case, not that terribly long time ago. And that's why I think those are the stories and lessons that we need to learn today, and sort of say, this is really what's at stake. So we can't just, take it for granted, this freedom, and then think, oh, well, that was in the dark past. Now we know so much better. So we are omniscient, and we can limit free speech without any of the negative side effects.
Yeah. The principle that we seem to have forgotten fairly recently that is similar, it's a principle that you put on the shelf and use when you need it, or forget about it at the wrong time. And that's torture. For decades, everybody talked against torture. The Turkish government was always not allowed to join the EU because it allowed it officially and so on. But when something happened to us, we immediately turned to it and forgot what's the purpose. The purpose of that principle is so that when you feel like doing it, you don't. And you made a nice comment earlier, just before we started, about how Republicans and Democrats thought about something between 2017 and 2021 about the media. So why don't you tell that little story so we frame it, and then we'll go back to the history.
Yeah, at least since 2016, so the whole concept of mis and disinformation or fake news, as a certain former president liked to label it, has been a huge part of our conversation, not least due to social media. And so back in 2017, when President Trump was constantly railing against the so-called fake news media, whom he labeled the enemies of the people, he talked about opening up libel laws that would make it easier for people like himself to go after and sue the media when they wrote something that he didn't like. And then there was a poll, I think it was published in The Economist, which showed that a plurality of Republicans, something like 43%, were in favor of granting the president powers to punish the media if they sort of reported things that were biased or inaccurate. I don't have the exact wording of the poll. And of course, Democrats were very skeptical of that, didn't support this at all. And then fast forward to 2021, when mis and disinformation is very much set in, amidst the pandemic. And of course also the 2020 election and sort of the tsunami of conspiracy theories that were launched by Trump after that. You now see that Democrats support the federal government and private tech companies to do much more about misinformation, whereas Republicans are dead set against it. Mm-hmm. And so, but the idea is that if you changed the law back in 2017, if you had the power to sort of override current First Amendment protections, that principle would have protected. Restrictions on free speech basically always protect those who are in power. So that would have protected Donald Trump at the time. So his government could, have sued, New York Times or CNN. He did that, but typically unsuccessfully. Whereas, today it might have been Democrats. So the danger is, of course, that the law will be used in a politicized, tribalist, and deeply partisan manner to protect those who are in power, and then you risk, of course, it being rather than sort of being the beneficiary of restrictions on free speech, you risk becoming the target when power changes hands, and suddenly the laws against misinformation that you were willing to advance at one point you will see them as oppressive and authoritarian at a later point.
There's a great line in the play A Man for All Seasons by Robert Bolt about Thomas More, where there's an argument between Thomas More and his son-in-law, Roper. And Roper is adamant and vigorous young man, and he's saying we need to stop Satan from all the misinformation that he's giving out in our society about these religious issues, which were roiling at the time. And Thomas More says, are you not going to give him due process of law? Are you not going to give Satan due process of law? Well, of course we won't give Satan due process of law. He says, in that case, once you've trampled over the law, there's no law left once he's at your door. It's an old argument, and it's it's interesting that one of the Catholic saints argued in favor of giving due process to Satan, and I think that's what made it a nice little vignette in describing how he thought about things as a lawyer. But you also in your book mention one of the few times that has been put into law, but the Sedition Acts that John Adams put in as president, they had a sunset provision that it came to an end at the day of the next election, just in case they lost the election. I thought that makes it perfectly obvious what you were just talking about. Yeah, it makes it perfectly obvious that you want to shut down their side, but just in case. Yeah, exactly,
and I think that's a great reminder. So you have sort of arguably the greatest generation of Americans. You got your Adams, your Hamilton, your Washington on one side of the Federalist, and you've got your Madison and Jefferson on the side of the Democratic Republicans, and the Federalists at the time sort of control the presidency and majorities in Congress, and they used the Sedition Act to basically go after their critics in the press, and both politicians and newspaper editors are basically imprisoned for writing things about Adams. And as you rightly said, so Congress and the presidency was protected, but not the office of the vice president, because that was Thomas Jefferson. And and of course the Federalists didn't mind. They were doing a great job of going after Jefferson, accusing him of all kinds of things, but they didn't want him to be protected. So the partisan nature of that was obvious. And these were men that prior to and during the Revolutionary War, those who had been part of that too had argued that British restrictions on free speech were sort of akin to slavery almost, and that united them in their cause, for independence, where free speech was sort of seen as the bulwark of liberty. But then suddenly, when the Revolutionary War had been won, when free speech was entrenched constitutionally, ultimately it amplified their differences. It no longer bound them together to a common cause. Their political differences were amplified, and sort of with the threat of war against France in 1798, the huge political polarization just meant that they didn't no longer, I guess, trusted each other sufficiently to ensure that the great bulwark of liberty extended to both sides in the political debate among people who had recently been united in their cause for sort of American independence and freedom. So I think that's a very instrumental thing. And interestingly, even though Jefferson was a harsh critic of the Sedition Act, and in his inaugural address when he'd won the presidency, he gave a great speech in which he said, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, and sort of saying that we can handle our differences out in the open. We shouldn't punish that through laws. But then in 1803, when he's been president for a couple of years, he himself has his name dragged through the mud in the Federalist Press, and he writes these private letters where he says, maybe it's time that some of the Federalist newspapers are being prosecuted in various states, and some of them were. So he didn't, he didn't push for a new Sedition Act, but it showed, even Jefferson was willing to compromise on free speech when it really got to him.
Yeah, people, once they get power, they get tired, and that's your history is filled with it. They get tired, actually, of everybody complaining about them. I don't know if today's social media will help us get over that, because the chat rooms are filled with everybody's complaints. And if you just listen to the complaints, that's fine if people complain. I think one of the things that we don't pay attention to about all that is that when people are saying when they're angry certain things, that doesn't mean they think that all the time. If people in a marriage took seriously all the angry words that were said, it'd be very hard to hold a marriage together. And I think the same thing should be true about our societies. People should have an option, an opening for saying their angry words and then going back home and forgetting about it again. It's something that I didn't have the room for in the book, but it's sort of the old sort of Roman Stoics had this attitude towards insults that they, you shouldn't take them to heart. You should ignore them or even sort of make light of them, or even sort of laugh at yourself if you were the butt of a joke. Mm-hmm. And I think there's certainly, free speech does come with costs and harms. Some of those harms can be serious. We can talk about perhaps the January 6th attack on the Capitol. I don't think that would have happened without social media. But there's a lot of as you rightly mentioned, there's a lot of things being written, in anger or in the heat of the moment on social media that, if we can develop a more detached attitude to what your crazy Uncle Joe writes at 1 a.m. on Facebook, you don't necessarily need to get agitated about that. So I think you're absolutely right. But I think it's very difficult for humans to do. We're sort of in the midst of moving from sort of the analog age into the fully digital age, and it's a completely new mindset. It's a new culture of communication. It happens at a very different pace than most of us have been used to and have ever experienced. And so I think it will take a long time before we've developed sort of the mental modes, the culture, the institutions to cope with living in the digital age, and I think for a while we'll be likely to engage in sort of moral panics about what is being said and written, and sometimes these panics are born out of real concerns, but the problem is that very often the cure proposed is worse than the disease, especially when it comes to censorship and restrictions on free speech, as, for instance, the Sedition Act is a good example of that. Another element, I think, with social media and our current culture is that we have other social goals besides free speech. One of the social goals is to give voice to the voiceless, people who didn't have access, and now the internet has made that possible. Well, people, I think, were expecting those voices to sound just like theirs, but they don't. I mean, the reason that they've been voiceless is because before people did not want to hear what they had to say. Now, this is what they want to say, and people are going, well, I don't want you to say that. So I think people have got to get used to the fact that everybody can have a voice, and everybody can, that's the whole point of a democracy. Everybody can have an input, and we just have to agree on a few small things that are the rules of the game. We don't have to agree on what you think about your Uncle Joe and his ideas, all that kind of stuff. People can be all over the map with their ideas and not really get in our way. And I think it'll take time to get used to that idea.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think what we're seeing today with social media is sort of a rerun of a recurrent theme throughout the history of free speech. So I talk in the book about two competing concepts of free speech. One of them is an egalitarian conception of free speech, which dates back to the Athenian democracy, which for the time, not by our modern standards, was very egalitarian in the sense that all freeborn male citizens could participate directly in democracy, so they debated and voted directly on the laws. But they also had a cultural practice of free speech called parousia, which means something like uninhibited speech, which meant that even foreigners, someone like Aristotle, for instance, could engage in free speech and poke fun at the gods and their social betters. Of course, there were limits, as Socrates found out, but this is a very different concept to the one that dominated the Roman Republic, which was much more a top-down conception of free speech, in which the sort of senatorial elites, people like Cicero and Cato, were the ones who engaged in free speech, and where the ordinary plebs, the unwashed mob, did not have a direct voice in assemblies, for instance. And those two concepts have been battling it out, and we see what I call elite panic break out every time the public sphere is democratized or is expanded to previously voiceless groups, whether it's through new technology. It could be the printing press, it could be the telegraph, it could be radio, and now the internet. But also when it went through political reform, sort of extending the right to vote to equality to racial or religious minorities, to women, and so on. You see the elites that were sort of the institutional gatekeepers and had a privileged access to shape and participate in the public sphere, that they fear the effects of giving a voice to sort of groups that they view as too uninformed or credulous or fickle or undeserving of a voice in the public sphere. So I think that's very much what we see right now when it comes to social media. And again, some of the elite panic, has real concerns. As I mentioned, there are harms and costs of having free and equal access to speech. It can lead to, ultimately even to violence, and misinformation can, increase the risk of a pandemic getting out of hand. But again, I would say sort of historically, the cure is worse than the disease. And I think that is especially true when it comes to minorities. So today, I think, especially among sort of liberals and progressives, there's this idea that free speech entrenches unequal power relations and is hurting minorities because it allows, white supremacists or bigots and racists to have a voice that you would not see previously, because no one, an editor at the LA Times or would not publish something from, the local branch of the neo-Nazis.
Right.
Whereas today, they can go online and they can spew their hatred. But I would say that, free speech might be the most powerful engine of equality that human beings have ever stumbled upon. And it has been essential for minorities and oppressed groups. So I'm sitting here in DC. I'm very close to Lafayette Square. And so in 1917, you had American women protesting outside the White House for the right to vote. And I think they were burning an effigy of President Woodrow Wilson at the time. And they were arrested and fined, many of these women. And so I was living in New York in 2018 with my family, and I took my son to a museum on the Upper West Side. And then when we left the museum, there was a huge demonstration by tens of thousands, mostly women, who were wearing these pink hats. And I won't say what they're called, these hats. I'll self-censor myself. And the NYPD were protecting them while they were calling the president of the United States, all kinds of things, and holding up placards. And, that to me was a very powerful image of how First Amendment freedoms, even though the wording of the First Amendment had not changed, but sort of the interpretation, the expansion of First Amendment freedoms had come to, protect women, to claim a stake for equality. And whereas before, they would be arrested if they challenged patriarchal power structures, they could do so with impunity a century later. And you see the same thing when it comes to slavery, when it comes to Jim Crow in this country, where you had laws in the South in the 1830s that would prescribe the death penalty for distributing or engaging in abolitionist material, whereas an abolitionist like Frederick Douglass advocated a universalist free speech ideal that didn't depend on the color of your skin or the size of your wallet, and who said that free speech is a very precious right, especially to the oppressed. And I think we've sort of unlearned that lesson, but I still think it's a lesson that is very, very much true today.
Yeah, you talk a lot about the history of women in this issue and their vote, et cetera, et cetera. And I think one of the things that's important in the fact that we're allowing the freedom to speak and the voiceless getting their voices, I think is partially responsible for the other element of where the line is wanted to be drawn on free speech, because a large number of women are saying, we want a safer space. We want something that we're not so afraid of. And if men can't understand why that emotional part of their preferences is there, they don't know anything about history either. And so if that's the price, people say, well, we should pay that price. If it's the price of minorities having a chance to say what they want to do, whether it's a racial minority or a sexual orientation minority, people can say what they want to. But I think what's important is for each group to realize, as you just pointed out, that actually even though it has problems with it, mostly the cure is worse than the disease if you push away free speech. I think everybody can recognize this important thing about, say, safe spaces at school, et cetera, but not. You can have that and have free speech at the same time.
Yeah, and of course we have to make some distinguish. So female journalists who are threatened with rape or that's obviously crossing a line, and those who engage with that should be prosecuted. I agree. I certainly agree with that. But I also understand women who engage in the public debate or on social media who are met with sort of outbursts that do not reach the threshold of threats or incitement to violence or the like, that it can be sort of a strong disincentive to participate in the public debate. The problem, I think, is when you push sort of centralized content moderation on big private tech platforms, or if you say the government has to step in. I think we should tinker much more with allowing users on social media, for instance, to have much more control over their own content, rather than having Mark Zuckerberg decide centrally, pushed by this interest group or the other, or sort of trying to sort of say, well, where would in today's political atmosphere, where would I get the least backlash when I draw the lines. So I think that would be a healthier way to do it, because obviously, being on social media does not mean that you have to listen to every crazy voice out there. But we're not going to get in agreement over whether content is offensive or not. And there's nothing wrong. It's very human to be offended. The problem is that we have big differences about whether content is offensive or not. So if you want that decided centrally on big platforms with billions or hundreds of millions of users, you risk the lowest common denominator being the decider, and that's why I think a more decentralized information environment on social media is sort of a more Solomonic solution than the current attempts to sort of push big tech platforms into policing everything centrally.
Yeah, San Francisco is a good example by itself as a culture. I mean, it's been pretty open and free for a long time, and there's a large other cultures in the world that find that extremely offensive, that freedom. But what goes with all the freedoms also goes with the liberty to have new thoughts, and the creativity and the Silicon Valley whole engine is all part of the culture of a time. And you were talking before we were chatting about how important the law is, but also even more important, how important the culture of freedom is. And you mentioned, when you go back to Socrates, that the Greeks were proud of the fact that they allowed free speech, and that was a new thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that really is one of the things that set the Athenian democracy apart. If you read the great Athenian statements, Pericles, his famous funeral oration that many probably read in high school or college, he talks not only about why the Athenians are special because they have democracy where everyone has a vote, even if they're poor, but also that they're sort of tolerant of each other's sides that might rub the other the wrong way. So they have a comparatively tolerant culture. Another great Athenian statement is called Demosthenes, and he says something which I think is true today, even though it was said maybe 2,300 years ago or so. He says, the difference between Athens and their bitter rivals in Sparta was that in Athens, you could criticize the Athenian constitution and praise the Spartan constitution. But if you were in Sparta, you were not allowed to praise the Athenian constitution, and you were certainly not allowed to criticize the Spartan one. And so I think that's still the litmus test of the core of free speech, is that you're allowed to criticize the political system under which you live. But in Athens, it was to a large degree more sort of a cultural trait rather than, in the way that Madison would draft what became the First Amendment. Of course, Madison's genius was that he saw the dangers and the deficiencies of the Athenian model of direct democracy, where revengeous mobs could pass laws, or in jury courts could convict someone because they didn't have individual rights in the same way that Madison conceived of them. They didn't have checks and balances or independent judiciary in the same way that the U.S. system does. So he built on top of that. But as I mentioned, so the First Amendment was ratified in 1791. The wording hasn't changed, but throughout its history, the First Amendment has allowed, as I said, critics of President Adams to be imprisoned, people to be prosecuted for insisting that slavery runs contrary to the Bible, for protesting for the rights to vote of women, been thrown in prison for 10 to 20 years for opposing American involvement in World War I, and so on and so on. And what has changed, I think, is to a large degree the culture of free speech. So it has become more permissive as these abuses, if you like, have manifested themselves, and people have become aware of the dangers of a narrow interpretation of the First Amendment. And that's why, even someone like John Stuart Mill, when you read On Liberty carefully, he talks more, or at least as much, about how free speech does not only depend on protection against the magistrate, but the tyranny of majority opinion being imposed on dissenters can be as much of a tyranny as restrictive laws. And so I think if the American culture of free speech deteriorates, if Americans start demanding through partisan lenses more and more restrictions on free speech, chances are that whether it's in 10 or 20 or 30 years, there'll be a Supreme Court majority that interprets the First Amendment in a very different way than today, sort of maybe going back in time and reviving some of the old permissive restrictions. And then that'll at least be half the country who will be very dissatisfied about where the lines are being drawn. Yeah. For instance, I would imagine that post 9/11, if the First Amendment hadn't provided as strong a protection of free speech as it did, I think I could very well imagine that in the atmosphere post 9/11, immediately there would have been passed all kinds of sort of sedition laws that would have made it a crime to say and do things that could be seen as insufficiently patriotic or the like. But as it were, there was a strong legal protection of free speech that had really been built in the second half of the 20th century, not least due to the efforts of the civil rights movement, who won a number of landmark cases that really expanded the protection of free speech. And I love this quote by the late congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis, who said something like, without free speech and the First Amendment, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. And I think that history is really important to sort of to look at current free speech issues through the prism of what went before and the landmark achievements that this helped contribute to.
Yeah, you mentioned in there about cultural trades, and one of the things that I think is going on is that we are borrowing from China their shaming culture, while they're borrowing from us capitalism, and they're getting a little bit advantage out of that, and we're kind of. And it's not that it's a Chinese thing, it's a human thing. But they pushed it very far, and it kind of ties into our Puritan past, where the Puritans were kicked out of their country because they wanted to exercise their right to speak about their religion and so on. But as soon as they got here, they made sure nobody else could disagree with them. And all the colonies seemed to split up based upon which group it was that was excluding other groups when they got started.
There's an apocryphal quote from Lenin. Says something to the effect that the capitalist will sell us the rope with which we'll hang him, and I think that there's a little bit of truth in that when you see sort of some of these Silicon Valley companies that initially were sort of very, very much wedded to this civil libertarian techno-utopian ideal of the internet bringing free speech to all corners of the world, and that censorship was sort of buried on the ash heap of history that was part of the 90s and early 2000s. And then you have sort of big American corporations helping China build the great firewall, sort of Google secretly working on developing a search engine for the Chinese market that sort of incorporated the dictates of the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's a very, very dangerous development. But I think you're also right that at this very sort of hyper polarized time in America, each side, this is of course a generalization, but tends to have their ways of trying to impose orthodoxy on the others. So on the one hand, you have attempts, for instance, at universities and colleges to have professors fired. I think the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, has documented more than 500 cases of teachers and professors attempts to have them disciplined for things they said since 2015. On the other hand, now we're seeing a tsunami of Republican-backed bills to oppose so-called critical race theory, which is not only limited sort of to K-12, but even to sort of higher education, and that tries to basically ban divisive concepts of race and gender, and even sort of censor discussions of American history that do not really conform to what Republicans in these states think, their picture of American history. I think that's an extremely dangerous development because it eats away at the culture of free speech from each side, and then ultimately sort of the center might no longer hold. So this is something I think Americans should be concerned about, and to a large degree in open democratic societies, free speech advocacy means holding your nose and defending the principle of free speech for people that you really, really do not disagree with and whom you dislike. Because that's basically where the line is. Those who test free speech in open democratic societies will typically be those whose views are the most unpopular, and so you got to be prepared to do that. But I think today we tend to be. It has become difficult for many people to distinguish between defending the principle of free speech from the underlying speech that someone is engaging in, and that sort of being able to distinguish between the principle and supporting the actual speech is absolutely crucial.
In your book, you talk about, we were talking about the professors just a little while ago, you have a story about the University of Paris long ago shutting down some professors, and then other universities poaching those professors. As you can give that as a warning to the schools that get too tough on their professors. So why don't you tell that story?
So this is all the way back to medieval times, where sort of Aristotelian philosophy becomes irresistible to these great medieval scholars who really wants to use pagan philosophy and reason to a much larger degree than what was permissible at the time. And initially, the church and university authorities try to push back, but it's just impossible, because these, the curiosity of these scholars is insatiable, and sort of Aristotle is just he just changes everything, gives completely new perspectives, and then obviously ultimately sort of Aristotelian philosophy becomes part of orthodoxy. It
Thanks
wins
to Thomas
the day.
Aquinas, right?
Thomas Aquinas, who draws also on interestingly on sort of the philosophical efforts of Arab and Persian Muslims who in the Abbasid Caliphate, which is an interesting story in and of itself. But we see that pushback at universities throughout history. We also see it, interestingly, in the era immediately prior to the Civil War, in the 1850s, sort of the University of North Carolina, I believe. There's a professor of chemistry there called Benjamin Hendricks, and he openly supports John Fremont, so the first Republican presidential candidate who's opposed to slavery, or at least the expansion of slavery. And he's burned in effigy on campus. Students demand and parents demand that he should be fired. And interestingly, you have the wording used in newspapers and by the trustees is that it is dangerous and unsafe to have someone like Hendricks, like someone voicing Black Republican opinions, to instruct the youth. So the language is basically mirroring some of that which you see today, where some students and even faculty say, that it's dangerous, or we need a safe environment at campuses, and that specific opinions endanger the safety of students, even though they would be, even though they would perhaps think that it's they come at it from sort of an anti-racist and inclusive agenda, whereas the University of North Carolina is very openly a sort of a white supremacy agenda. But I think it's interesting to see this continuum in the use of arguments used to try and limit the permissible speech in universities. You even saw it sort of 1917, Columbia fired 2 professors who were against American involvement in World War I, and you had the New York Times publishing an editorial praising the trustees of Columbia for getting rid of these dangerous socialist radicals who abused academic freedom to sort of poison the minds of students. And I think that sort of these cases should give pause to those who think that it's a sign of progress to sort of police the speech of professors and teachers at universities.
Yeah. Part of the framework of your book, to go back to what you've mentioned, it is the difference between, say, the top-down Roman Republic approach to free speech and the more egalitarian version from Athens. And one thing you mentioned, we have the British Empire, and then the Americans kind of take over, and now Europe is very influential. And I was just wondering where in Europe you feel that it's more the egalitarian approach. Is it in smaller countries? And because even though America made a big experiment out of this, as we always say, the experiment has been taking place in lots of other countries for a long time. And maybe we should start learning from some of the things that are done there. So if you have an angle on that coming from Denmark, we'd appreciate it.
Yeah, no, I think there are lots of things that the U.S. can learn from various European countries, but on the legal regulation of free speech, I think the tendency in Europe to me is very concerning. So there's been really for the past decade or so, and sort of increasing number of laws restricting free speech on a number of issues that would fly in the face of the First Amendment in this country, and very much I think social media, especially probably after the 2016 U.S. presidential election and Brexit, so you very much European approach of sort of an elitist concept of free speech, sort of a desperate attempt to impose some kind of top-down control of the public sphere. But of course, there have been, European trailblazers of free speech. I would say that the Dutch Republic was sort of in the 17th century. Even in the late 16th century, you saw Dutch thinkers who advanced sort of free speech early on. But the Dutch Republic was a place where it was not egalitarian free speech by our standards, but compared to most other places on the continent, very much so. And it was not due to laws. It was not due to a constitutional protection. It was that the Dutch provinces had a large degree of self-rule, so there was a very weak political center, and the Dutch were great fans of commerce. So there was also sort of this aspect. You could produce books that were banned in other European countries, and you could sort of smuggle them across borders. And also, one province might benefit from another province intolerance, and printers could simply skip lines and then make money. But there was also a more sort of cosmopolitan atmosphere in cities like Amsterdam, for instance, and that's why you see, René Descartes, you had Spinoza, you had John Locke, you had Pierre Bayle, sort of great free thinkers who contributed to the idea of freedom of conscience and freedom of expression, who made the Dutch Republic their home, this little piece of windswept country in a corner of Europe became sort of the printing hub of Europe, and the first place where sort of newspapers catering to the ordinary man, and mostly man, was developed. So I think there are great roots there in the Dutch Republic. But by modern standards, I don't think that the U.S. should look to Europe because I think even European democracies are very much contributing to what I call the free speech recession that I see going on at the global level, where free speech is sort of we might still be living in a golden age of free speech, but it's a golden age that is in decline, and unfortunately, democratic Europe is contributing to that.
I'd just like to remind our live stream audience that if you have any questions for Jacob, you can just put them in the chat room and we'll try to ask him. You mentioned at the same time as the Dutch Republic that the Mughal Empire in India, a Muslim empire, was actually more open at that time than probably any other culture. It's still maybe not open by our standards, but certainly had a lot more freedom in the 17th century after Akbar. So that builds a little bit upon the small time frame in Baghdad, maybe of 100 years after the Muslims had succeeded and maybe were feeling very confident, and then they also opened up their society to new ideas. So why don't you talk about that? Because I think it's always useful to find out that in other cultures, other times, they also had these movements towards it and then away from it again.
Yeah. So it's especially associated with Akbar the Great, this ruler who, I think scholars disagree on whether he actually left Islam or not. I think some would argue that he did, but he certainly was not an Orthodox Muslim, and he enraged sort of the religious scholars of his time by developing this sort of eclectic religion that where he sort of took a dash from all religions and mixed it together. And he also created sort of he took the sting out of a lot of the sort of harsh Islamic laws that the Mughals were imposing on society, and he created sort of an early think tank, you could call religious think tank, and sort of extolled reason and freedom of conscience. Now he didn't, he was still sort of a military absolutist ruler, so it's not that he allowed free political speech, but it was certainly sort of religious freedom that was very much ahead of its time, and allowed for discussion of religious heterodoxy that you wouldn't really find in Europe at the time. I think one of the weaknesses of his rule, even though sort of religious tolerance would continue, if in diminished forms after his death, was that it was very much a top-down approach. So it didn't really create this culture of free speech. It was very much Akbar's ideas, and then when they didn't, because it wasn't sort of a bottom-up approach, it didn't really catch on among the masses, perhaps, and so it was quite vulnerable. In the same way that you see in the 18th century, during the Enlightenment, a lot of European rulers, absolutist rulers, were sort of smitten with the idea of free speech. So Frederick the Great in Prussia, or Catherine the Great in Russia, even Joseph II in Austria. Sort of these absolutists, enlightened absolutists, who thought that they could use free speech, at least for the elite, to sort of cultivate progress, philosophy, science, and so on. And then once the French Revolution sort of breaks out, there's a complete change of things, and everyone sort of looks at free speech as this recipe for disaster, for radicalism. And you see, even basically until the second half of the 19th century in Europe, at least, you see a clampdown on free speech all the way. But it's true with the Mughal Empire. There was a high degree of religious tolerance, and even in Europe, if you go to Transylvania, if you go to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they had sort of quasi-constitutional protections of religious freedom that went much further than what was the norm in Western Europe, where we tend to think of religious freedom having its sort of genesis.
It'd be useful, I think, to understand both the way Russia and China, in their semi-post-communist sort of, but still very authoritarian way, have adopted some ideas for freedom in terms of economic freedom, but not for political freedom. It's very much like these other absolutist rulers from the past that take in one idea or another, experiment with it, and then say, oh, we didn't want that to happen. It's just so common in history.
I think, I think after the death of Mao, there was sort of very small period in China where the idea was that the Mao's rule had been such a disaster in many ways, that they needed new ideas, and they needed some degree of free speech from the people to get new and better ideas, but also to allow people a certain voice. And they experimented a little bit with that. But then when criticism turned towards the party, that was sort of quickly put under that was clamped down on. And then, of course, with the Tiananmen massacre, that was the end of any sort of experiment with free speech in China. And I think the current Chinese government is I think it's sort of a battle prop between Stalin's Soviet Union and Xi Jinping's China, on which government has been the most oppressive and most censorious, sort of on a systematic level. And I think the Chinese are probably winning that contest.
So let's talk about probably one of the most difficult, because it's so painful, ways that drawing this line on freedom exists in Europe right now, and that's in Germany. Because Germany has this history of Nazi. The Nazi history is worse than our slavery history in terms of just total destruction of people, et cetera, et cetera. And so after World War II was over, they passed not free speech laws. People cannot mention anything. You cannot show a Nazi swastika, et cetera. Now that's been going on, and certainly one could argue that helped shift their culture away from that faster than if they hadn't done that. But now we're talking 70 years later. So is there a time when that can be, do you prefer, or would you advise, if you were an advisor to the German government, that it's now time to phase that out?
Yeah, it's something that in the book I call the Weimar fallacy. And so to a large degree, European laws against hate speech, for instance, and sort of extreme expressions are very much based on the premise that because the Weimar Republic, this sort of short democracy between 1918 and 1933, fell, and the Nazis were sort of democratically elected and were participated in the public sphere during Weimar Republic, that democracies have to be militant, sort of this based on the ideas of a German immigrant professor called Karl Löwenstein. And so that's the idea. But in the book, I look at what was the atmosphere like for free speech during the Weimar Republic. Now, in many ways, of course, the Weimar Republic was very liberal, so it had a constitutional protection of press freedom, so much wider protection than under Bismarck, that went the empire that went before. But in many ways, it actually limited free speech in ways that we would find unacceptable today. So, for instance, when it comes to radio, it was essentially government pro-government censorship. So Nazis and communists did not have access to the radio. There were a number of laws to protect the republic that were passed that would allow state governments to administratively ban a newspaper for up to 8 weeks if it disseminated false information or attacked the institutions of the state. And these were also used against Nazi newspapers. And Adolf Hitler was banned from speaking in a number of states for years. So Joseph Goebbels, who later became the propaganda minister, founded this newspaper called Der Angriff, which is basically based on trolling Jews, and he sort of proudly proclaimed his newspaper to be the most frequently banned newspaper in Germany. Julius Streicher, who was who founded Das Stürmer, the most sickening anti-Semitic newspaper in the Third Reich, he was sentenced to 2 months imprisonment in 1929 for publishing these anti-Jewish blood libels. And a year later, in Nuremberg, his hometown where he was convicted, the Nazis gained an increased share of the vote. So, in a sense, the Weimar Republic, in many ways, did vigorously try to use censorship and restrictions on free speech to prohibit totalitarian ideologies, but it didn't succeed. And ultimately, the Nazis used the laws that were supposed to protect democracy to abolish democracy. And I think that's a warning that current democracy should heed. I'm sorry if you hear some noise. I'm in a hotel and there's a vacuum cleaner in the background.
It's way in the background. It's not disturbing anything.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting the way you laid it out because, as you said, Hitler was able to say, now you're yelling at me, but you didn't, for free speech, but you didn't give me free speech before, and therefore you're being hypocritical. And of course, but I thought it was also interesting that he got everyone to tie in by saying, let's get rid of those, socialists and the communists. And so he got all the right-wing parties to agree with that. And as soon as he finished them, he turned to them and shut down the other ones.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, you're right. I mean, if you go back to one of the first speeches he gave all the way back in 1920, it's quite clear that Adolf Hitler never had any love for free speech. He wanted, the press to be limited to sort of Germans, nationals. He thought that there was sort of a lying press dominated by Jews and Marxists and so on. So he was completely insincere. But it sort of the idea, the fact that the Nazis had been the victims, if you like, of free speech restrictive laws allowed him sort of the argument of whataboutery, saying, okay, what am I doing differently than you're doing? And until the Reichstag fire decree, which basically suspended basic liberties the Germans sort of build on existing laws when censoring their opponents. And as you rightly said, there was a huge appetite for going after communists and socialists among many Germans who were deeply worried about the potential for a communist takeover, and he could use that to get support for punishing them. And then ultimately, within 6 months, he had created a totalitarian one-party state in which he had convinced the other sort of right-wing parties to abolish themselves, and sort of a wave of political suicide, if you like, of political parties. And so I think that, and I think it's really important not to try and understand the history of the Weimar Republic and the Third Reich through the sort of reductionist, narrow lens of free speech and censorship. There are so many other things and factors, and many of them probably more important. But I think if your argument is that we need to limit free speech in order to avoid the rise of new Nazi parties, then I think the Weimar Republic does not give strength to that to those arguments.
Right.
And I think those who want to limit free speech in open democracies should have the burden of proof that these laws will actually work and not lead to negative unintended consequences.
You call democracy and free speech a counterintuitive cultural development by the thing, and it's counterintuitive to people what you just said, but the history shows that. And I think if it shows it in the case of the Nazi rise to power, there's nothing that dangerous going on in our own societies today that matches that kind of danger. And so we're already willing to move the line when it doesn't even work, when it's even worse. I think it's a really important lesson.
Yeah, but I think whenever you're faced by a threat, I like to think of human beings as sort of the original software that we've evolved and that we're born with. I think its default mode is set on intolerance, and then we've built gradually this patch or update, which is called free speech and tolerance on top of it. But unless it's vigorously protected, the default mode will try to override it, and we'll switch back to intolerance, and especially when we feel that there's a high degree of uncertainty, when you feel that there's polarization, when you feel under threat, and then you can convince yourself that maybe today the degree of polarization and partisanship in the U.S. is as big a threat as what I've certainly seen that analogy a number of times in the U.S. that what's going on right now in your country is somewhat analogous to what went on in the Weimar Republic, which I think is quite a bit of a stretch, given that democracy has a longer history than what it did in Germany at the time. That we were not in the middle of the Russian Revolution. That we were not just emerged from World War I, where the Germans had been defeated, and so on and so forth. But I will grant this: free speech is an experiment. There's no guaranteeing that the outcome will always be positive. It might well be that one day someone grabs power through the use of free speech, and your republic will no longer stand. Who can? There's no guarantee. But what I would be able to bet on is that if someone was to use free speech to gain power in order to finish American democracy, the very first thing such a person would try to do was to abolish free speech.
Yeah, exactly.
and I think it's interesting to compare sort of Trump with Putin. Both of them were, at least in my opinion, presidents with very illiberal tendencies that tried to subvert democratic norms and the rule of law, of course, to various degrees. But Donald Trump was ultimately powerless in punishing the media, in locking up his political opponents. In fact, some of them became media stars due to their criticism, whereas Putin has been in power since 2000, and he's used state power to kill, imprison journalists, and create sort of a power structure based on official propaganda and censorship. And so if the First Amendment was instrumental in the rise of Trump to the presidency, I think it was also instrumental in removing him from office again. And then we can pick up the conversation at the end of 2024.
Hope not, but probably. Well, first, thank you very much for your help in trying to keep that patch on top of our our natural intolerance alive. And we have one question in from the audience, from Doug Threloff. He said, can Jacob talk about the concept that a free press is essentially the fourth branch of government and discuss the significance of the impact of the ruling on Sarah Palin? That's his question. Now, you were just talking about the free press. So how do you think this free speech, free press, the two different rights connect with each other?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on the First Amendment, and I just saw sort of a very brief segment, I think, on CNN that a judge sort of dismissed the defamation suit by Sarah Palin against New York Times, and that is, I believe, based on the New York Times versus Sullivan case from 1964, which sets a very, very high bar for when public officials can successfully sue not only media outlets but anyone who criticizes them in public. And interestingly, that's also a civil rights era case, because it used to be the case that Southern authorities would use libel and defamation laws to go after critics. So if they made sort of a small mistake in their reporting, they could threaten them with lawsuits that could sort of cripple them. And so New York Times versus Sullivan sets a very, very high bar for that. And I think that's ultimately a good thing. I think, the New York Times acknowledged that they had gotten, that they had published something that was incorrect, but there wasn't. I think maybe the standard is something like actual malice. So they acknowledged that they had been factually wrong and printed a correction, and that I guess is why Sarah Palin is unsuccessful. Now compare that to France, where President Macron. Someone was fined the equivalent of $11,000 for producing a billboard showing Macron basically looking like Adolf Hitler as part of anti-COVID demonstrations. Now imagine in this country how many people could get sued if they protested the current or the previous president as someone who was totalitarian. It would be an endless stream of. So I think it's I prefer that free speech protects hyperbole and bad faith arguments, and that you really have to have a really high bar for public officials and the powerful to be able to sue people who say things about them that they don't like. I think that's, if you're a powerful public official, that's part of the costs of the power that you're exercising on behalf of the people, that the people whom you represent and in whose name you rule and are able to sort of pass laws or enforce laws have a right to criticize you vehemently, and sometimes that will hurt, but that's that's part of the price of that, because I think if you give the press or even ordinary people a disincentive, you make them afraid to shine a critical light on public officials. I think the consequences of that will be worse, because you risk not exposing some of the inevitable corruption and dirty deeds and sort of that public officials commit and have always committed, and it will ultimately, I think, risk also creating an incentive for public officials to be less afraid of committing illegal acts or corruption or the like, because hopefully they'll fear that if they do so, the press will be shining a critical light on them.
Yeah, it's just about the very definition of a slippery slope, as we say in the law. If you don't hold that standard way up there, anything you start moving it, the next thing is, because as you said, the natural tendency is for all of us to be authoritarian.
Yeah,
we want the world to be the way we want it to be.
And traditionally, the New York Times versus Sullivan case turns on the head the way that speech, rulers, laws on speech have worked throughout history. Traditionally, speech codes, if you like, have protected the rulers against their subjects, not the other way around. The First Amendment and free speech is there to protect the people against the abuses of their rulers. And I think that's a very important principle to safeguard. And inevitably, that will give rise to speech that is hyperbolic. Some of that will be misleading and false. But I think that's a price worth paying.
Yeah, on humanity's long road to democracy, which we're kind of just getting started on. I mean, a democracy where every individual gets to do what they want to the extent that they're not violating somebody else's, will too, and that there are no differences based on anything. We're so far from that, but it's absolutely crucial if we're going to get there to keep these principles in mind. Because we're not going to get there without it. And we'll get there with lots of bumps. And as you said, the cure is worse than the disease. And it's hard when the bumps are there, when the cure seems like it could work, to remember that. But we have to keep reminding ourselves, or we're not going to get to where we wanted to go. So thank you very much, Jacob, for joining us. And good luck with the book. And thank you all very much for joining us at the Commonwealth Club in its 120th now year of enlightened discussion. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks a lot.